Welcome to On the Right Side of History with Kansans for Life. Come with us as we connect the pro-life movement's past to present, uncover hidden or forgotten history, and its connections to the battle still raging today. Now, here's our host, Danielle Underwood.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us again here today. We really hope you're enjoying these podcasts and sharing them with friends and family. Today, Wesley J. Smith joins me in the studio for the first of two podcasts. Wesley is an award-winning author, international speaker, and chair of the Discovery Institute's Center on Human Exceptionalism. After leaving a full-time law practice to pursue writing and public advocacy, Wesley authored 14 books and over 1,500 articles. He's also a regular contributor to Epoch Times, National Review, First Things, USA Today, Newsweek, and American Spectator, among many, many others. And he's appeared in over 1,000 television and radio interviews on life issues. For a very good reason. He has incredible expertise and is regularly requested by members of the legislative and executive branches of government to speak on issues related to euthanasia, assisted suicide, biotechnology, bioethics, and many other related topics. So thank you so much for joining me here today, Wesley.
Well, thanks for having me.
So you cover very weighty topics that affect us much more directly than we realize. And these are important. It's an important part of our mission to protect life through the lifespan, which from the pro-life movement's perspective, all of these issues fall directly underneath the pro-life movement, our belief in protecting life from womb to tomb. So your expertise is on threats that typically impact adults, and especially euthanasia and assisted suicide. Those have been a couple very important focuses of your writing, your speaking, lots of things that you've helped explain over the years and identifying threats to life. And you're also very respected in those other areas that I mentioned too. But the foundation of your work, from what I've learned, is that you really build upon this idea of human exceptionalism. And I thought maybe we could get started by just you explaining, what do you mean by human exceptionalism?
Sure. When I got into this work, I got in through the anti-euthanasia, anti-assisted suicide spot. A friend of mine committed suicide under the influence of the Hemlock Society. And I was so appalled by that, I asked her executrix to send me her suicide file. She was very organized. And inside this file were proselytizing newsletters called the Hemlock Quarterly. Hemlock Society is now called Compassion and Choices. It was more honest back then about its goals. And it was a how to commit suicide packet with the drugs to take, their toxicity, how to use a plastic bag, and so forth, which is precisely how Francis had done it, my friend. And I was so appalled, I wrote a piece for Newsweek magazine called The Whispers of Strangers. I was not involved in these kinds of issues at all at that time. And I got such pushback from what I thought was a non-controversial warning against this euthanasia-assisted suicide movement that I thought, what happened to my culture and where was I when it happened? And that's what kind of like had me shifting my approach to my work completely into starting with anti-euthanasia. That led to, well, look what's happening in bioethics. And that led to other issues that I address. And I started to, I don't know that I coined it, but I started to popularize the term human exceptionalism. And what does that mean? People will say, well, why don't you just call it sanctity of human life? Well, because it's more than that. Of course, on one side, it is the sanctity of human life, or the unique dignity of human life, the intrinsic equal value of all human beings. But there's more to it than that. There's also the fact that we as moral creatures have duties. We have obligations. We have duties to each other. We have duties to our posterity, the people who are going to come after us. We have duties to treat animals humanely. We have duties to be properly respectful of the environment and so forth. And I thought, well, you can't have just sanctity of life, because that doesn't take in the whole enchilada, if you will. And so I started to use the term human exceptionalism, and I've used it ever since. So it's been about 20 years, 25 years I've been using that term.
Okay. So that's interesting because, it really does point to how different the human person is from, say, an animal.
Sure. And we're the only known moral species in the universe.
Mm-hmm.
If an animal kills a baby, the animal hasn't done anything evil. The animal hasn't done anything immoral. The animal is amoral. The animal has done something very destructive and dangerous, but it's not like the animal can be held morally accountable because the animal doesn't have that perception. Whereas if I did that, it would be completely different, which is why I can commit a crime and my dog can't.
I understand. So I'm just curious. So you first became interested in these topics by that very personal and deep wounding experience with your friend.
And if I may, to interrupt,
yeah,
most people who were involved in the euthanasia-assisted suicide movement on both sides of that issue come into it from a personal experience. Often people who are pro-assisted suicide may have had a family member they loved who did not get proper medical care. And so they think, well, the answer to their, painful death is assisted suicide. And I always find that ironic because while they don't trust doctors to control pain and control symptoms, but they trust the same doctors to kill them, it always seemed very bizarre to me. But both in the pro and anti, often there is a story to tell.
I bet that these stories so much drive what we do as people, and that stories drive our culture. So what I hear you saying is that they had some misdirected compassion. We hear...
Or fear.
Oh, interesting. Talk more about that.
Yeah, a lot of pro-assisted suicide advocates and people who support it, let's say in voting or in polls, are afraid of dying as opposed to death itself. They're afraid of being in pain. They're afraid of, particularly of dementia. And I think fear drives a lot of that movement, the fear of ending up in a circumstance where they will be allowed to writhe in agony. When that's a false premise if people receive proper medical care. I was a hospice volunteer for a period. The last patient I worked with was a fellow, I can give his name because he wrote an article, named Bob Salamanca. Bob Salamanca had ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, and he was dying. And we got to know each other very well. I guess I worked with him the last 7 or 8 months of his life. And he told me that he had wanted, when he got diagnosed, to go to Jack Kevorkian, who, for your listeners and viewers who may not know, was doing assisted suicide in the 1990s, where people would fly to Michigan, be hooked up to a carbon monoxide canister, and then that was called death with dignity, right? But he wanted to because he was so devastated by this very difficult diagnosis. And he said to me that when he went to his priest, the priest was so freaked out by it that the priest only gave him 5 minutes. Now, most priests wouldn't be that cold, but this was the experience that Bob had. And Bob said he felt like he was a burden. You often see that. I don't want to be a burden on my family. And so he wanted to go to Kevorkian. His family, thank goodness, said no. And at that time, I was in California. California had not yet legalized assisted suicide. So Bob did not commit suicide. And then he told me, and these are his words, one day I came out of the fog and I realized how glad I was to be alive. And he said that he became very resentful of the euthanasia-assisted suicide movement. He said, and these again are his words, this is very close to a quote, "They're trying to drive me off the well-lit boulevards into the dark alley." And he was really adamant about it. And he wrote a piece, which can be found on the internet, called "I Don't Want the Choice to Die" by Robert Salamanca, Salamanca. And he ended it with, I'm living with ALS. I live it vibrantly every day. And when he did eventually die, he died peacefully in his sleep, which often happens with people with Lou Gehrig's disease. But during that time frame, I would often debate, not often, 4 times to be totally honest, Jeffrey Feiger, who was Jack Kevorkian's lawyer. on Good Morning America, on Charles Grodin's show, various shows. And he would always say, people are going to die choking on their own spit. And I would correct him every single time. No, not if they get proper medical care. That can be totally prevented. And he would say it anyway. And then I realized these people don't care about telling the truth. They just care about fear-mongering. I shouldn't have called Feiger a liar on Good Morning America. And then I got chastised for being personal, but there was a history there.
That's funny. Well, yeah, call a spade, right? So, I think that what I'm hearing you say too is that there is this deep-seated fear of suffering.
Yes.
That is part of our culture now.
In fact, it drives our culture.
Oh, interesting.
The fear of suffering drives our culture today. It's in the abortion debate, because fear of suffering isn't only that I'm suffering, but I'm being deprived of what I want. There's two sides to that. It's in the euthanasia debate. It's in a lot of the other radical reproductive technologies, where if I don't have a baby, then I'm going to suffer, so I will take increasingly radical steps to try to have a baby and this kind of thing. It has replaced, in my view, the call for righteousness and for protecting life. So this society today in the West in particular, and I think it's a form of decadence, is driven by the fear of suffering. And excuse me, and when you realize that, things begin to fall into place. They become more logical. Whereas if you think it's back in the old days of the 50s and 60s, you'll think, well, this is insane. But not if you realize that the point of society has shifted. Then it becomes a logical progression. And that's what I think the pro-life movement needs to understand. That's what they're facing. And so when, just getting to abortion real quickly, a pro-lifer says, well, look, that's a human being, which is obviously biologically true, scientifically true. People don't care, even though they might say, well, no, it's just a clump of cells. No, they know. They don't care, because that's no longer the priority. The priority is to prevent suffering, or to make sure that nothing happens that makes me unhappy and unable to attain what I want.
That's a heavy challenge ahead of us.
Yes.
And so when do you think that shift really started to happen?
Boy, that's a good question. I think it happened slowly over time. I do think that by the time the assisted suicide movement began to pick up steam, which was in the early 90s, that the shift had really moved. And I think since then it has accelerated. I don't know what the precipitating event would be. I think it might be, and this is just supposition, we became so successful that the things that made us successful, which is hard work, the ability to put off satisfaction, the willingness to suffer for something, the ability to overcome pain, became less pronounced. And this may seem disconnected, but I remember back during Vietnam, the question was whether I would be drafted. And my father came to me and said, I suffered enough for both of us, son, because he was in World War II. So the greatest generation who raised the baby boomers really wanted to protect their kids from things like World War II, which was horrible. I know of my dad's experiences. I mean, just horrific fighting in the Pacific, the Depression, and so forth. And our parents, who loved us so much, wanted to protect us. And I think in doing so, they went too far. And then we became adverse to any kind of suffering and often to sacrifice. And that, I think, has harmed the country.
I think you make really great points with that. I also think that there is some amount of a desire for control.
Yes.
That is certainly part of this.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting when you see that playing out even to the extreme measures that some of these activists want to go to try to control even the environment. They don't just want to control their own lives. They also want to control really the entire world, the atmosphere, all these things, these incredible
because if they're not in control, they'll be suffering.
That makes perfect sense, actually. That's a really good tie back for us. So I think that a lot of our listeners are starting to hear this topic reemerge in the news because of what's specifically happening in Canada right now.
Yes.
We're starting to hear quite a bit more. But before we talk about Canada, because I definitely want to dig into that, because I know that you know so much about what's happening there, and I think we would like to know that. But let's back up and say it's not just Canada. It is also happening even today in certain parts of our own country. And when did that what was the first state that legalized?
Oregon. Oregon had an initiative in, I believe, 1992. No, I'm sorry. It was 1994, called Measure 16, I believe. It's a long time ago. And it was to legalize assisted suicide for people diagnosed with terminal illness, 6 months or less to live. It passed 51 to 49%. There had been previous initiatives that had failed. In California, there had been one that had failed. In Washington State, there had been one that had failed. But Oregon, it passed. And it passed mainly because the advocates ran an anti-Catholic campaign of Pope, keep your hands off our body, and this kind of thing, plus the fear-mongering of dying and the idea that this is just going to be an itty-bitty tiny change, a safety valve to prevent suffering that can't be alleviated, which is a false premise. And the law, by the way, no assisted suicide or euthanasia law requires pain that cannot possibly, or suffering that cannot possibly be eliminated. That's the selling point, but it's not in the way the law is written. Actually, ironically, the closest is the Netherlands, which has wild euthanasia, including mental illness, elderly people who are frail, disabled people, chronically ill people, and of course the same thing is happening in Canada. But the myth became, because of Oregon using the terminal illness, not because that's where they want it to end. That's not the ceiling, that's the launching pad. And that would get people to accept the principle that killing is an acceptable way to end human suffering, at which point the idea is to expand it for more and more categories. The problem for the other side in this country is the United States has not fully swallowed the hemlock. And so the myth of the terminal illness, this being about people who are dying, has to persist because they have to convince people to accept it. But once it is accepted by the general population, that's when you get the Netherlands, that's when you get Belgium, that's when you get what's happening in Canada, because the logic of it, well, if suffering justifies suicide, assisted suicide, or homicide, which is a lethal jab euthanasia, where it's legal, it's not murder, then there are a lot of people who suffer far longer and far more intensely than people with terminal illnesses. How can we say no to them when we say yes to people who are dying? And of course, that's the logic, and that's why it spreads and expands over time. But even here in the United States, where all of the states that have, there are 10 states that have legalized it, and when you include the District of Columbia, they all have the terminal illness limitation, but it all depends on self-reporting by the doctor. There's really no way to be sure that's true. And all of these states, or at least most of them, have already expanded their laws to reduce waiting times, to make it so that there doesn't have to be a residency requirement. Some states even allow telemedicine for assisted suicide, which means the doctor who prescribes the poison may not even have actually met or physically examined the patient. So the idea is to push as far as they can. And the United States, it's pushed a little less because, again, society-wise, we have not yet swallowed the hemlock. But if we ever do, it will. The terminal illness limitation will not stand.
I hear so many parallels with what you're saying. And, comparing that to the pro-life movement and abortion, what abortion providers have also tried to do to eliminate the waiting periods, to eliminate the in-person doctor requirement. We've seen that in our own state, that they've been suing our laws and trying to remove those protections.
Sure. Well, here's the scam. We will have strict guidelines to protect against abuse. Oh, okay, we'll allow this little law with strict guidelines to defend against abuse. And as soon as the law is in place, the strict guidelines to protect suddenly become obstacles. And this person had to go through these hoops. This person had so many hurdles to overcome to get the assisted suicide. So that's the immediate switch once it becomes legal. Before it's legal, it's one approach. After it's legal, it's another approach. And this is particularly true in the media, which is a pusher of these agendas because they think it's progressive and compassionate. It's also unthinking on their part.
Yeah, I think you're completely 100% right in how you're explaining. You're unpacking this so well for us to understand what this creep looks like. So if you look then...
They used to call it the slippery slope, right?
Yes.
And they'd say, Wesley, you're arguing slippery slope. In fact, in that first article I wrote, Whispers of Strangers, and people can find it on the internet. That's what the Newsweek article was called. 1993. I predicted, and I had no expertise. I just followed my logical thinking, that if we allowed this, eventually it would end up leading to conjoining euthanasia-assisted suicide with organ harvesting. I called it as a plumb to society was the term I used in the piece. And I was Wesley, you're an hysteric. Even people who opposed assisted suicide, we'll never do that. Guess what? In the Netherlands, euthanasia and organ harvesting are conjoined. Often the people who are euthanized are mentally ill or disabled people, and they are looked for organ harvesting because they've got good organs. And, as somebody with cancer might not have good organs. It's done in Belgium, and it's done in Canada. And in Canada, in the province of Ontario, if somebody goes to a doctor to be killed, euthanasia, lethal jab, the doctor, once the doctor approves the euthanasia, contacts the organ donation society that asks for people's organs when they're dead and facilitates organ transplants. And that society will then contact the person who's going to be killed to ask for their livers and for their kidneys. It's the most amazing thing. And rather than being appalled, people in Canada are seeing it as a plum to society. Oh boy, these people don't want to live, and now we can get their livers. And for people who do want to live. And it's so insidious and dehumanizing and turns people, once they are killable, they become a different category of life. They become usable, they become objects. Jack Kevorkian, for people who don't remember, he wasn't actually trying to alleviate suffering. He wanted to do human experimenting on people he was euthanizing. That was his goal. He wanted organ harvesting for people having assisted suicide and so forth. So actually what happens is the dystopia of Jack Kevorkian, who was ghoulish as heck and yet made a hero in the media, is coming true in Canada, in Belgium, in the Netherlands. And if ever we move beyond assisted suicide in this country to lethal injection, it'll happen here too.
It's very frightening. It almost sounds like the human body is being treated more like a factory for organs.
It's an organ farm.
It's an organ farm.
Yep.
And that those organs almost begin to be treated as more valuable than that human life.
Exactly. In fact, there was a horrible case recently in the Netherlands of a 16-year-old girl, she had brain cancer, who decided that her death would be better than her life because she could donate organs. And they accepted her for euthanasia. They accepted her for organ donation. They put her into a deep sedation for 36 hours. Why? It wasn't to benefit her. It was so that they could test her organs and they could find suitable donors that would be compatible. So she and her life became secondary to the organs that were going to be obtained. And she was treated that way. And again, in the media, it was like, hey.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Back to that boon for society.
Plum
for society.
Exactly. Yes.
Wow. So one of the things that we talk about sometimes on the podcast here is the types of words that are used to really gloss over, I call them pretty words. I call them gooey euphemisms. That works too. Yeah. But the idea is the same, that, unfortunately, our opponents in this fight between the culture of life and a culture of death They are extremely adept at using words to really mask their true intentions.
Right, and people should realize that if you have to mask your true intentions, there's something wrong with your movement.
Mm-hmm.
If your intentions are honorable and if they're righteous, you can be very frank and descriptive. For example, assisted suicide. Assisted suicide, that term, is often castigated by the media and by the pro-assisted suicide people as unduly causing fear and causing scorn and causing stigma. That's the term they like to use. But it's accurate and descriptive. Suicide means to kill oneself. That's the mean. It's not why. It's what. And assisted means you got help.
Yeah.
So it's an accurate and descriptive term. What they push is what they call medical aid in dying, which is euphemistic and is not accurate. And they like to call it MAID, M-A-I-D, because that even takes away the dying word.
Yes.
Right? So it becomes almost you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And then instead of calling an intentional overdose poison, mm-hmm. which is what we used to call it, and which would be if a child took a bottle full of opioids and died, you'd say that child was poisoned.
Yes.
Wouldn't you? Instead, they call it medication. It's medication. No, it's poison. The medication that is taken is medication if it's used, for example, to properly treat pain or properly assist with sleep, then it's medication. But when you do an intentional overdose, it's poison. Mm-hmm. And so accurate and descriptive terminology is really important. And I really get angry when assisted suicide opponents use the term aid in dying or medical aid in dying. You're using their lexicon. When I've seen in Catholic press very much against euthanasia, calling it medication. Why would you call it medication? It's poison.
Yeah.
Let's be honest what it is so people can decide they want what is being pitched, but make sure they understand exactly what it is they're calling for.
Very true. So some other words, I think, assisted death, physician-assisted death,
Death with dignity.
Death with dignity.
Like my dad
yes.
who died from cancer didn't die dignified. Mm. My mother who died from Alzheimer's didn't die dignified. I resent that completely.
Oh, tell us some more about that.
Well, death is part of life, but dying is not dead. It's living. It's a stage of living. And part of our obligation under human exceptionalism is to help people when they come into serious illness, serious disability, and a terminal condition. So my dad died of cancer back in 1984. He got hospice care. In fact, I'll tell you a funny story. It is funny. Dad was like I told you, the World War II veteran, very tough guy. And he had colon cancer that had spread to his liver and so forth. And he once had to have some surgery to try to clear his bile duct. And I went in to see him. He was holding an ice pack to his side and kind of writhing in agony. And this was long before I was in these issues. And I said, Dad, didn't they give you something for the pain? And he said, yes, they offered it, son, but I didn't want to get addicted. And I went, oh my gosh.
Strong man.
Yeah. And I said, Dad, and my father was dying. Mm. And I said, Dad, you're a tough guy.
Very tough guy.
You won't get addicted. And if you did, you could beat it. Mm-hmm. And so he looked at me very gratefully and said, okay. And you know what? He had several months left to live. He was never in pain again because he got proper hospice care. And back in those days, hospice was the big thing, and it should have been. Properly caring for dying people, giving them pain control, giving them spiritual support. In fact, as the hospice volunteer, I was told that if anyone comes across with a suicidal ideation, I have to tell the multidisciplinary team because suicide prevention was part of hospice. Mm. And today, some hospices cooperate with assisted suicide, even though the founder of the modern hospice movement, Dame Cecily Saunders, who I had the great honor to interview for my book, Culture of Death, said that to support suicide for her patients was to deny their equal dignity and their equal worth as a human being. She was adamant that suicide prevention was part of hospice. So getting back to the Canadian thing, Organ donation. Somebody who is qualified for euthanasia will be contacted in Ontario by the organ donation company or the organization. Nobody will contact suicide prevention for that patient. It's a one-way street. So, and in Oregon, Colorado, and all of Washington and Maine and so forth, where assisted suicide is legal, if a teenager says, I want to commit suicide, suicide prevention will be called. If a veteran with PTSD wants to commit suicide, suicide prevention will be called. But if someone else says, I want suicide, well, let's call suicide prevention. I have cancer. Well, never mind. So those people are deprived of equal dignity because their people are saying, as my friend Bob put it, your life isn't as valuable anymore because you're a terminal illness, and we won't give you suicide prevention because you want this. This is autonomy. Well, a mother whose children have been killed or a business person whose business has collapsed and become suicidal, what about their autonomy? Why would we give them suicide prevention and not the person with cancer or some other condition? It's the same thing if you're going to believe that people are equal, if human exceptionalism prevails. And by the way, the end goal of this movement is death on demand. And it's already here in Germany. The German High Court, it's the Constitutional Court, the equivalent of our Supreme Court, ruled that there's a fundamental right in the German Constitution based on autonomy to commit suicide for any reason you want at any time. There's a fundamental constitutional right to have assisted suicide, and there's a fundamental constitutional right to assist in suicide if that's what you want. And it doesn't matter about health. It doesn't matter about anything. It's about autonomy. And again, remember, this is the drive, the full flight against suffering. So the Supreme Court has basically said if somebody is suffering, whatever the reason, and they want suicide, since we believe in autonomy, they should get it, and they have the right to it. Not just the power to do it, but the right to it.
Scary, very
It's
scary.
very scary.
Because I think could that not lead further even still?
Sure, and it will.
To duty to die.
It will. And there have already been arguments in the bioethics literature that there is a duty to die. That, in fact, in my book, Culture of Death, I get into that quite extensively, both the original version that came out in 2001 and the updated version revised in 2016, where the duty to die is advocated in bioethics. Not every bioethicist, but the idea is, in fact, Ezekiel Emanuel, you may recall, said that when I'm 75, I don't want any more care to take care of me because basically my life is useless at this point. He didn't say people should be killed or anything. But the idea is that once you've lost your productivity, your ability to have perhaps climb rocks and do the enjoyments of a younger person, your life is no longer worth living. Well, that's very insidious. It's very abandoning. And we used to think of elderly people who commit suicide or joint suicides of husband and wife, elderly people, as tragedies, which they are. But now in places like the Netherlands, Canada, and Belgium, you actually have joint euthanasia killings of elderly people, sometimes because the only suffering is their fear of future suffering, of being widowed and being without their partner.
Fear of loneliness.
Exactly right. In fact, loneliness in Canada has been, in polling and in the statistics that they like to keep about euthanasia, has been a factor in many euthanasia deaths.
That's heartbreaking. So,
in fact, I have one anecdote, excuse me.
Yeah, go for it.
One of the worst cases, and I've heard of very bad cases, was in Canada. During COVID, an elderly woman in a nursing home, there was the lockdowns like we had here, where she was not allowed to be with her family. She was isolated. The lockdowns ended, and she was again able to be with her family. Then they were going to have a second lockdown. And so she said, I want euthanasia. Why? Because she couldn't stand the isolation. She was granted euthanasia because she was a frail elderly person. And guess what? They let the family be with her when she was killed. They wouldn't have let them be with her to help her live because of the lockdowns. That's the bitter cruelty of euthanasia.
That is cruel. That is an upside down world.
It is.
All right. Well, this is very heavy. I mean, it
Now
is,
you see why I'm so much fun at parties.
but you are a wealth of information. And but I know that we have some things. There are some wins that are happening against this effort.
Yep.
I guess one quick thing I'd want to ask you before we do jump into that. You know, we typically talk about the predatory industries that profit on the suffering of others or also on the desperation of others. I'm going to guess that when you were talking about that organ harvesting, the alignment between this medical aid in dying, quotation marks around that, the physician-assisted suicide, and those organ harvesting programs, somebody is profiting from that.
Well, of course, it's not happening in the United States. I think we should make that clear.
Very good point.
But in the Netherlands and Belgium and Canada, where it is happening, the for-profit medicine is not as pronounced as it is here.
Okay.
I think it's more ideological.
Okay.
And I think, at least in those countries, I think it certainly could be about money. I mean, Canada has starting to have stories about all the money they're saving for their healthcare system because of euthanasia, millions and millions of dollars. And as they've been expanding eligibility, of course, it's going to increase the savings. In Canada, actually, there have been 2 recent cases that I'm aware of in the last, say, 6 months of cancer patients who asked for euthanasia not because of their cancer, but because they couldn't get an oncologist to treat their cancer for like months, but they could get euthanasia very quickly. And there was one of the patients had a terminal cancer, but could have, with treatment, chemo or whatever, lived a year or longer, but she couldn't access the therapy. So by the time she came close to being able to even see an oncologist, it was too far gone, and so she asked to be euthanized. Another cancer patient couldn't get a doctor for months, and so asked to be euthanized. You can see how abandoning that is. And once you accept that the idea that death and killing is a splendid way of dealing with suffering, you can see, well, why should we make sure that these cancer patients can get a doctor right away when we've got euthanasia? In fact, there was actually a quote that I have in my book, Forced Exit, where a Dutch doctor said, "Why do I need palliative care when I have euthanasia?" And that once you accept killing, once you get past the yuck factor, if you will, it becomes the easier approach, doesn't it? Because palliation is very hands-on, very intensive. You have to make sure that the patient is titrated and followed. Euthanasia is slam, bam, thank you, ma'am.
That's so sad.
It's very sad, and it's a betrayal of everything this country used to represent.
Yes, it really is. So let's talk about any kind of hopeful things you can tell us. Obviously, it has efforts to push this into other states have been stopped.
They've been stymied. That is actually some of the best news. Is when Oregon passed assisted suicide in 2016, the advocates said, okay, now it's going to sweep the country. Opponents push back. And the opponents are a very diverse group, by the way. People like disability rights activists who are not pro-life on abortion. The AMA still opposes assisted suicide and certainly doesn't oppose abortion. The pro-life movement been a very interesting and diverse coalition that when it comes together and works, it can stop these even in the most liberal states. So the fact that they've been, it's a tragedy that they've gotten about 1/3 of the country in terms of population, because of California, of course, is covered by assisted suicide laws. But it is actually something of a triumph that it hasn't gone farther than it has, that digging in your feet has been able to hold back this darkness, this terrible tide. So that's good news.
Very good news.
That is very good news. And I think that there's good news in the fact that people who are fighting this awful cause are not discouraged, and they don't quit. even though resources are completely overwhelming on the other side. George Soros' foundation, for example, puts tens of millions of dollars into this, and you have very wealthy people who support this. But the grassroots activists, which make up the opponents, don't quit. And they fight hard, and they've won in blue state after blue state after blue state. Massachusetts had an initiative to legalize assisted suicide, and Ted Kennedy's widow came out against it, and guess what? It lost. They haven't been able to push it through yet in New York. They're trying again now. They haven't been able to push it through in Connecticut. These are not Bible Belt states. They're trying again now, but they haven't done it yet in Maryland. They're trying again now. But blue state after blue state after blue state, to use that term, have not been able to pass assisted suicide. And so as long as people stay adamant, I think you can keep it from spreading the country. Because once it spreads the country, then we're going to go the way of Canada if people generally accept it. So what has been the response of the euthanasia people? Well, let's do away with residency requirements. One of the strict guidelines that we're going to protect against abuse, well, Vermont and Oregon have gotten rid of residency requirements. So anybody from Texas, from anywhere, can go to Oregon or to Vermont and get an assisted suicide like they do in Switzerland, where they have suicide clinics. So we are now going the way of Switzerland in that sense, where people can go to be made dead. And it's a really awful thing. Do never believe the mantra that this is going to be restricted and we're going to prevent abuse, because those rules are just there to give false assurance. They're not actually there to control anything.
Wow. Well, that's a powerful encouragement to us to continue to fight the good
Keep
fight.
fighting. Keep fighting.
Yes.
And one of the things I've admired about the pro-life movement has been the crisis pregnancy centers, which, regardless of what the law is, saves lives. If this thing goes south, as it might, I don't know, then there's going to have to be the equivalent of that for people who want proper care, who want to be cared for and have their hand held. And people now can make sure that if someone is dying, make sure you visit them. Don't let them become isolated. Make sure they're still us, because too often, as my friend Bob did, he felt like a them. Everyone is us. And it's our job, whether we're pro-life on abortion or not, to include everybody in terms of this issue in the community and in an accepted us category.
And yet another parallel with that fight over, to give more women all the reasons they need to choose life for their babies. We have another parallel between what we can do individually and also as small groups or organizing groups to give that kind of help that individuals need.
Time for one more good piece of news?
Yes, please.
So, back in the 90s, the euthanasia people tried to do a Roe v. Wade on assisted suicide. And they brought it to the Supreme Court. I actually filed an amicus brief in that case for the International Anti-Euthanasia Task Force, which is now called the Patients' Rights Council. And 9-0, it was determined that there was not a constitutional right to assisted suicide. And at the time I said one of the reasons I think that happened is because the pro-life movement kicks up such a fuss after Roe that the Supreme Court didn't dare do it again, right? But it was 9-0. And then when Dobbs came in, and I read the Dobbs decision, guess which was the primary precedent for overturning Roe? The assisted suicide Washington v. Glucksberg was the primary precedent that led to the overturn of Roe v. Wade. So the assisted suicide advocates who wanted a Roe v. Wade for assisted suicide ended up euthanizing Roe v. Wade.
Wow.
Which I found wonderfully ironic.
That is amazing. That is, wow. Well, it has been so fun to talk with you today and just to get this kind of really important overview to help us all understand much better the factors that are working within our culture today, those forces that are trying to push this really pro-suicide,
it is pro-suicide.
Death, pro-death
it's a death agenda, yes.
Future onto us as a country. If I may, I just want to go ahead and plug your podcast. And,
Oh, no, please don't.
I would love to. Obviously, you can find many writings by Wesley online, and the best place you can find information from him, he does host his own podcast and has many very interesting guests, not all of whom agree with you
Correct.
on these. So I think that's a very courageous choice on your part you're willing to go head to head with anyone on any of your topics. So you can find his information at humanize.today, and you'll also be able to find those podcasts there. And I definitely recommend that all of our listeners go there and hear much more from you. So I just want to say on behalf of Kansans for Life, thank you so much for joining me today. And also thank you to our listeners who listened in. If you care about life issues and you're looking for something you can do today to help, please share this podcast with friends and family. If you want to stay up to date on this and all pro-life topics, visit kfl.org and sign up to receive our updates. That's kfl.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at Kansans for Life. And as we say goodbye, never forget, the pro-life movement is on the right side of history. Truth always wins in the end. We hope you'll join us next time. Thank you.